video lessons, we've covered carbohydrates, protein, and calories. And in today's video lesson, we're going to cover the third macronutrient, which is going to be dietary fats. Some main functions of dietary fat, because it's super important that we get enough, is, as we mentioned in previous lessons, energy reserve. Your body's main source of stored energy is body fat. Okay, but it's also got other important functions like hormone productions to keep you healthy and functioning at an optimal level. It's also going to help insulate your organs, so when you're moving around and being physically active, they're not just bumping into each other. So fat has a lot of important features. We want to make sure we're getting an appropriate amount of dietary fat into our diet. It's important to note a couple of key things about dietary fat. The fat you eat is not the same thing as the fat on your body. They are not a direct translation of each other. Eating more dietary fat is not necessarily going to lead you to storing increased amounts of body fat. Okay? While dietary fat has more calories than both carbs and proteins, coming in at 9 calories per gram of dietary fat, which is more than double the 4 calories per gram of both carbohydrates and protein. You could see how overeating dietary fat could easily lead you to overshooting your daily calorie goal. Remember, what dictates if you're going to store excess body fat is if you're eating more than your body requires to burn on a daily basis. And if this is going to come from dietary fat, it will lead to body fat storage. It's also important to note that body fat, because it has more calories per gram than the other macronutrients, is an easier food to overeat because small portions lead to higher calorie content. A good example of this, like we talked about in the protein video, is peanut butter. While peanut butter, 2 small tablespoons of peanut butter contain almost 200 calories. That's a lot of calories for such a small amount of food. Another way to show this difference between calories in high-fat foods and low-fat foods, like high-carb foods, is take, for example, an avocado and an orange. While they're both technically fruits, the majority of calories in an avocado are going to come from fat, while the majority of the calories in an orange are going to come from carbohydrates. So both about physically the same size. An orange is only, for the entire thing, going to contain about 80 calories. Whereas the avocado is going to give you about 250 calories for eating that entire fruit. So you can see how this difference can make a huge difference in how many calories you're getting on a daily basis. To answer the question of how much dietary fat you need, this is really not a hard target number to meet. Here's my recommendation. Once you set your daily calorie goal, this is going to create the upper limit of total amount of food you can consume on a daily basis. So within those limitations, you're going to then set your protein goal at about 1 gram per pound of your ideal body weight. And that's going to take away about 30% of your calories. And then you're going to choose your carbohydrate goal, which will range anywhere from 30 to 50% of your total calories, depending on your activity levels and your personal preference. Okay? Let's say for this example, you're going to take 30% of your calories coming from carbohydrates. So if you have 30% from protein, 30% being taken up by carbohydrates, this 60% of your total calories is already accounted for. So the remaining 40% of calories is going to come from your dietary fat. So if you want to figure out the specific number of grams of dietary fat to hit, what you'll do, after you've taken away your total calories from protein and carbs, that remaining amount of calories, all you have to do is divide that number by 9, because again, there's 9 calories per gram of dietary fat. Divide that leftover calories by 9, and that is going to be your number in grams of dietary fat you should eat on a daily basis. So while we're proactively determining our carbohydrate and protein goals, we're going to work backwards then to figure out the remaining goal in fat grams. There are 2 main types of fat. There's going to be unsaturated fat and saturated fat. Okay? Saturated fat is going to be animal product fat. So fat that comes from meats or eggs or other dairy products, that's going to be the saturated fat. Unsaturated fat is going to come from plant sources, olive oil, sunflower oil, and other such oil-based fats that you're going to consume on a daily basis. Now, the important distinction between the two is unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature, like olive oil, and saturated fats are solid at room temperature. Like if you think about the marbling on a nice piece of steak or other red meat, that is the saturated fat from that animal. Okay? Now, in general, we want the majority of our dietary fat to come from these unsaturated fat sources. You can have a small percentage of your daily fat coming from saturated fat, like cheese, like other dairy, like meat, without a negative consequence to your health. But if the majority of your daily fat is consistently coming from saturated fat sources, that's not going to be the most ideal for the best all-around nutrition approach. So you have saturated fat and you have unsaturated fat sources. There is a subtype of unsaturated fat called trans unsaturated fat. Of all of the dietary fat sources, trans unsaturated fat, or trans fat for short, is going to be the one that certainly has no positive consequences from consuming it. It's all negative. Trans fat pretty much just works to hurt your health. Now, can you consume trans fat in small quantities occasionally and be okay? Absolutely. But again, if trans fat are making up a consistent and large amount of your dietary fat allotment, that is going to have negative consequences on your health in the long run. What is a trans unsaturated fat? A trans unsaturated fat is an unsaturated fat that's normally liquid at room temperature that's chemically altered to be solid at room temperature. So what they do is they add hydrogen molecules, hydrogenation is the name of the process, to this unsaturated fat molecules in order to make it solid at room temperature. Okay? Now, that chemical process is what makes these unsaturated fats and makes the fat more stable, so it's used in a lot of processed foods, things that need to be solid at room temperature. But that chemical process also makes it an unhealthy fat. So we want to make sure we're avoiding trans fats to the best of our ability. But the majority of your fat calories should come from unsaturated fats, with a little bit coming from saturated fats if you so desire. Now that we know our protein and carbohydrate goals, we can work backwards, like we talked about earlier, to then figure out our fat goal, and that is going to complete the puzzle for our daily nutritional requirements. So remember, the daily calories is going to create the limitations to your daily nutrition requirements, and then protein, carbohydrates, and fats are going to work together to fill in the pieces for your diet. If you're getting enough protein, you're going to be able to not only build new muscle tissue, but also preserve what you have and effectively recover from your workouts. If you're eating an adequate number of carbohydrates, you're going to be sufficiently supplied with good sources of energy to crush your workouts and make it through your daily activities. And if you're getting an appropriate amount of fat, you're going to protect your ability to create all of these important hormones within your body while not going hungry, but also staying within the realm of your calorie limitations. Once we can master this process, you then have the freedom and the power to control your caloric intake so that you can then swap foods in and out and approach your eating from a more global macro perspective and eliminate these erroneous labels of good versus bad foods. What I like to say is there are productive and unproductive foods. Okay? So with this knowledge, you're better prepared to determine your fat goals, figure out what sources of fat you should be including in your diet, and thus perfecting and rounding out a good nutritional approach to weight loss.